So we're talking about off-the-shelf software today. And if you look at the YouTube thumbnail, Steve, you're going to be proud of me. Do you even remember the store? Babbage's. Does that name ring a bell?
It does not. Not for me,
Oh,
no.
that I'm just dating myself, I'm aging myself here because when I thought about off-the-shelf software, that was the place you could walk into the mall and you could literally buy software off the shelf in a big box, and the box would be like a foot tall, but the disk inside of it was tiny, and that's how we used to buy software. But we'll be talking about off-the-shelf software later in the show today. Before that, an interesting little side dive into the world of tattoos. You would think that these things are medical devices. Interestingly enough, well, we'll get into that in just a minute. It's really interesting. Before we get to those as well as local events, I want to show you something. MedTech Crossroads has its first, I'll call it viral video. I hope it's showing up on the screen. We had this one on FDA cellular therapy. It's just been skyrocketing the last few days. So kind of fun to see. Thanks to all those who are watching. It's getting hundreds of views a day at this point. And so hopefully more like that to come, but we're very excited, and thank you to all of you who watch the videos and enjoy them and give us your good feedback. We really, really appreciate it. Tattoos, of all things, are they FDA approved? Is there a FDA tattoo removal process? What about the inks that are used in that? What about the tattoo guns? If you've ever had a tattoo or thought about getting a tattoo or thought about getting rid of a tattoo that you had gotten, there's an idea for a business. We put them on and we take them off. Sort of like viruses and antiviruses. I always thought that would be a great business pair together. Well, it turns out, as you've heard us many times on the show say, these things depend. If they're a device, it depends greatly on whether it meets the definition of a device. And up here on the iPad, we have the definition of a medical device. So we're going to start our conversation here. So does FDA approve tattoo guns? Do they approve tattoos? Do they approve, or we should be saying clear for these things, removal devices? And if we go all the way back to the idea of what is a medical device, the first thing that a medical device might be is something recognized basically in the recipe book, the National Formulary, or the United States Pharmacopoeia, or any supplement to them. I think in the 13 years that Into Being has been in business, we've encountered a device that we were working on that met this definition maybe once. The one that we encounter much more often is it's intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. And pretty quickly when you read that, you think to yourself, that doesn't have a lot to do with tattoos, does it? Interesting. There's a third thing that could qualify something as a medical device if it's intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals, which doesn't achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical action or metabolism. So right off the bat, you can be suspicious as to whether, are these devices? Are tattoo guns devices? Are the inks devices? And all we have to do is go look at FDA to find out that they are in fact considered cosmetics. And if you are familiar with the idea that the FDA is partly regulated under the FD&C, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, you realize that FDA is responsible for regulating cosmetics as well. So why talk about cosmetics on a show where we're mostly focused on MedTech development, right? Devices, drugs, combination products, biologics. Well, because the overlap of these worlds can teach us all sorts of things about the nuances that are going to drive our companies, our development processes. And frankly, if you're just asking how safe is this process, you might find this interesting. FDA says, and this is from a handout that they've put out in preceding years, FDA has not approved any inks for injection into your skin. FDA has not approved henna or hair dye for use on your skin. FDA does not regulate practices in tattoo parlors. Usually this is the job of state or local health departments. Well, that's interesting. You would have thought maybe they were regulating those things. We'll talk about cosmetics in more depth in just a moment. But it is true that the FDA monitors problems from tattoos and permanent makeup, and FDA does have a place to alert the public. But this isn't as in-depth as you might originally think. In fact, because these are cosmetics, FDA defines cosmetics as articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. Skin moisturizers, perfumes, lipsticks, fingernail polishes, eye and facial makeup, cleansing shampoos, permanent waves, hair colors, and deodorants, as well as any substance intended for use as a component of a cosmetic product. Well, that could certainly include inks in tattoos. I love this. It does not include soap. We are going to touch on that later just because you want to know now. Soap is not a cosmetic. It's soap. And we'll get to that in just a second. Of course, if it's intended to affect the body, it could be a drug or a medical device. And in this case, it's pretty clearly in the world of cosmetics, which FDA regulates but doesn't approve, which I found absolutely fascinating. It is true that the FD&C, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, prohibits the marketing of adulterated or misbranded cosmetics. So, for example, and this is just a partial list, a cosmetic is adulterated if it has poison or deleterious substances in it, if it consists in whole or in part of any filthy, putrid, or decomposed substance. I'm glad they're watching out for this. Or if it was held under insanitary conditions. There's more below that, and then there's also a definition of misbranded if you're making false claims about it. But FDA does not approve cosmetics before they go on the market. I actually found this very surprising. Our business is devices and combination products. And it turns out that they do not approve cosmetics, with the exception of color additives. That's the one thing that they do. But as we said before, FDA has never cleared an ink for going under your skin. So, who is responsible for safety? We're talking about the inks now. Who is responsible for the safety of the cosmetic? Companies and individuals who manufacture or market cosmetics have a legal responsibility to ensure the safety of their products. The law nor FDA regulations require specific tests to demonstrate the safety. I find that really interesting. And they don't have to share safety information with the FDA. They don't have to register. No registration number is required to import cosmetics into the United States. So for as hard as we think about the drugs we're putting into our bodies, you can slather cosmetics all over yourself, and there is nothing that FDA says about it. They do worry about insanitary conditions. Here's a guidance document that is in draft form. Insanitary conditions in the preparation, packing, and holding of tattoo inks, and the risk of microbial contamination guidance for industry. So it is true that they're concerned about bad effects coming out of things like adulteration and misbranding, right? Those are the things that FDA says they have jurisdiction over. But beyond that, those inks, they're not FDA cleared, they're not FDA approved. If something bad happens, FDA will come and try to let people know, but that's about it. Oh, one more thing while we're on the topic of cosmetics. What if it's soap? I love this from FDA. Soap is a category that needs special explanation. That's because the regulatory definition of soap is different from the way in which people commonly use the word. Products that meet the definition of soap, and this is all from FDA, are exempt from the provisions of the FD&C Act because even though it includes articles for cleansing in the definition of a cosmetic, it also excludes soap from the definition of a cosmetic. So they have a definition here of soap. You don't really care what the definition of soap is, just that it's different and it's not a cosmetic. So there you go. Well, what about removing tattoos? We haven't gotten to needles yet. We're going to talk about needles at the end here. But what about getting rid of tattoos? One of the most common ways is removing them by laser. And from what I understand, this can be a painful process. And it does turn out that FDA not so much because of tattoos, but because of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. They have jurisdiction to regulate light-emitting products and radiation-emitting products. It turns out they regulate all sorts of medical lasers, including ones falling under this product code, GEX, Powered Laser Surgical Instrument, which is defined as a laser for use in general surgery and in dermatology, intended to cut, destroy, or remove tissue by light energy emitted. It's a Class 2 device. Looks like there's some exemptions for that where it could be a Class 1 device. And devices are cleared all the time under product codes like GEX. They're not strictly for tattoo removal. Some are for hair removal, for example, there, or a pulsed dental laser system down there, or a dermal cooling device. All of these cleared under the GEX product code. So there's definitely a basis for these things getting cleared as medical devices. And in fact, if you look at one who got cleared, this is from a company called PicoCare. They're a company that got FDA clearance through the 510K process. And they are intended for use. So when we think about devices and we think about clearances, we think about intended use of the device. They're intended for use in surgical and aesthetic applications in dermatology. And this one wavelength is indicated for tattoo removal for dark colored tattoo inks and for multicolored tattoos containing dark colored tattoo inks in patients with all skin types, Fitzpatrick 1 through 6. And then they have another wavelength only for Fitzpatrick skin types 1 through 3 for lighter colored tattoo inks. So here's a medical device. It's there to remove tissue. And this is one thing that FDA says in one of their guidance documents is that, removing, you're not really removing, you're removing tissue. You're destroying stuff. And so in that sense, we are affecting the structure of the body. It falls pretty clearly under the realm of a medical device. There are other ways of getting that skin off: dermabrasion, ablative lasers to burn the top layer of skin entirely off, as well as surgical removal of tattooed skin, just literally to cut it out. As FDA says, technically these methods do not remove the pigment. Instead, they wound the skin above and around the pigment to stimulate an immune response. That's pretty clearly a reaction that the body is having. And the results are highly variable. So not a fun way to get things out. And if creams are attractive, FDA has not approved tattoo removal ointments and creams or do-it-yourself tattoo removal kits. So FDA says we don't have any evidence that these things work. So that's interesting. We've talked about the ink that goes in and said, yeah, FDA will come and do some cleanup afterwards, but they haven't approved inks to go under your skin. These are regulated as cosmetics. FDA talks about adulteration and misbranding, but they don't go and approve these things. So buyer beware. State and local authorities have jurisdiction over tattoo parlors, but at some level, you can put in kind of whatever you want. The way that you get them off, that's pretty clearly a medical device, especially if it's a laser-based one on 2 counts. It's affecting the function and structure of the body by removing skin and also stimulating an immune response, as well as being a radiation-emitting product. And so that sort of falls clearly within the purvey of the FDA as a medical device. So what about the needles? What about those needles that are bouncing up and down hundreds of times a second that actually inject the ink under the skin? I found this fascinating because this is a place that I came up absolutely empty. Couldn't find any evidence that these are FDA cleared in any way. It seems like it falls under, and again, not legal or medical advice, and just from the little bit of research that I did, was not able to find any cleared FDA tattoo guns. These appear to be completely under the jurisdiction of state and local authorities, even though they are punching holes 1 to 2 millimeters deep in your skin hundreds of times a second. When you think that hypodermic needles are regulated because we're injecting beneath the top layer of your skin, it does strike you as just a little bit odd how we ended up here. But speaking of needles, and this is fascinating, have you heard about microneedling products? So you would think this would all be together in the same world, but it's not quite. So we're going to talk about microneedling products for just a moment here, but we're also going to show how FDA has actually carved out tattoo needles as a completely different thing and isn't really regulating those, whereas microneedling products, which are exploding, they're very interested in. So what is a microneedling product? Well, and some of you who are making devices might be interested in this, and this will help keep you out of trouble with FDA because there's really two basic categories that you can fall into. One is a Class 2 device, the other is a Class 1 device. And it depends, as always, on your product claims. What do you claim the device is good for? Microneedling product is a generic term that encompasses instruments with common technological features that include an array of needles, micro protrusion tips, or pins, which can be blunt or sharp and of varying lengths. They have a wide range of uses, from facilitating skin exfoliation and improvements of the appearance of the skin to treatment of scars, wrinkles, or other skin conditions. Guess what? It's these later things that get FDA's attention more deeply. So if you want to go out there and sell needles for skin exfoliation, hint, it's going to be easier than selling it for treatment of scars, wrinkles, or other skin conditions. But, and here's how we got here, right? We're talking about tattoo guns and tattoo needles. Acupuncture needles, hypodermic needles, or other needles for injection, tattoo machine needles, needle probes that emit any type of energy or deliver any type of energy to a patient, and dermabrasion devices are outside the scope of this guidance. Now, they're not saying that we don't regulate them. They're just saying this guidance on microneedles has nothing to do with any of those other needle types. So don't take this guidance and apply it to any of the things we just showed you. It's only about microneedles. And certain microneedling products are devices, whereas others are not. At the beginning, we talked about the definition of a device. What was one of those key factors? Does it affect the function or structure of the body? That's the claim that's going to get interest from FDA. The more you say this affects the function and structure of the body, the more you're going to hear about it from FDA, raising things into the Class 2 categorization. Microneedling devices for aesthetic use are classified as Class 2 devices. Microneedling devices are different than dermabrasion devices, which are not within the scope of this guidance, but dermabrasion devices are classified as Class 1. They're exempt from pre-market notification. It's a much easier path if you're going to sell a dermabrasion device, even if it contains needles. Okay, that's the key. The technology may or may not make a difference in how FDA views this. There is a guidance document, guidance for dermabrasion devices, and those tend to be Class 1. They go back to the definition of a medical device, but here's something that's going to kind of kick you into a medical device. Are you saying it treats scars? Are you saying it treats wrinkles? Are you saying it treats cellulite, stretch marks, dermatoses, acne, alopecia? Are you saying that it stimulates collagen production or angiogenesis? Are you saying that it promotes wound healing? Those are device claims that you're making when you say those things. Can the technological characteristics change how it's viewed? They can, because if the needle length and arrangement of the needles is such that it could get into living layers of skin, it's going to be kind of hard to claim that it's just a superficial dermabrasion device. So whether it can get into living layers of skin is a really key factor here. But maybe you have a device and maybe it has some shallow needles on it that are to facilitate exfoliation of the skin, to improve the appearance of the skin, to give it a smoother look and feel, to give it a luminous look. Even if they have short needles on it, that doesn't make them devices. It doesn't necessarily make them medical devices. Something to look into more. So here's a couple examples. A manual microneedling product with short blunt needles, where the firm makes claims that the product is intended to exfoliate, give the skin a luminous look, stimulate collagen production, and treat wrinkles. Good or bad? Device, not device? What do you think? Well, this is kind of a trick question because FDA started with things like exfoliate, give the skin a luminous look, which might be okay. But here they're making medical claims, stimulate collagen production, and treat wrinkles. And this lesson is something you can take to any device type. What are the claims that you're making about your device? What you say your device is good for is how it's going to be regulated. Just got off a call this week with yet another client who wanted to know what their FDA path was. But to talk about the FDA path, we have to talk about what your marketing claims are. Because FDA is not, first and foremost, fundamentally a technology regulation organization, although they do regulate technology. They are first and foremost a marketing claims regulation organization. What do you say your product is good for? What do you say that it does? That's going to determine your regulatory path in ways that, if you haven't experienced it before, may be hard to believe. Here's another example. A microneedling product with short blunt needles or micro protrusion tips that do not penetrate living layers of skin, and for which the firm claims it's just to facilitate skin exfoliation. These are not devices. Or one below that gives the skin a smoother look and feel, but again, does not penetrate living layers of skin. Not a device. So this, hopefully, if you're making a microneedling product, this is sort of a subtopic to the tattoo placement and removal topic. If you're making a microneedling product, you might fall into the device category, you might not fall into the device category, or you might be a dermabrasion device as a class 1. It really depends on what you are claiming. So keep that in mind as you move forward. But what does it mean? Back to the question of tattoos as well as tattoo removal. It means that this is a mixed bag, that the inks themselves are not approved by FDA, but they are in some ways regulated by FDA against adulteration and misbranding. The parlors and the machines used appear to be almost entirely regulated by state and local authorities, which, depending on your state or locality, your mileage may vary. And the devices for removal, because they are affecting the structure and function of the skin, as well as generating an immune response, as well as being radiation-emitting devices for the most part, are regulated often as Class 2 devices by the FDA. Microneedling products don't actually overlap with this at all. FDA's guidance on it says, hey, this is a completely different category. But the key there is, what are the claims you're making, and really how deep are you going? Because going deeper and making claims will ramp up what you have to do. So if you're one of many looking at these aesthetic devices, I hope I got that right. Hopefully that's useful to you on the microneedling front. Back to tattoos really quickly. Reporting problems with tattoos and tattoo removal. For anyone who's watching and says, I came here because I wanted to know relatively how safe they are, or maybe I've had problems with tattoos and I want to get them off and I never want to do that again. Well, if you had an adverse negative reaction from tattoos or problems with tattoo removal, don't call us, but you can voluntarily report them to MedWatch, the FDA's safety information and adverse event reporting program. They do want to hear from you. They're sort of coming behind and doing cleanup on tattoos, but they're not going to be approving them anytime soon. If you liked that, we always say that free learning on MedTech Crossroads will help to smooth out your medical device development process. Please, if you liked what you heard today, like and subscribe the video and the channel so that we can keep getting information out. And thanks for listening today on the topic of tattoos. Are they FDA approved? How about the removal devices? Next up, FDA software approval. Many of you are interested in, how do I get FDA software? Well, we should really call it clearance. FDA doesn't generally approve software. Approvals are for PMAs. But what about FDA's new off-the-shelf software guidance? The thumbnail of this YouTube video is the old store Babbage's that was around in the 1980s, where you really could walk into a store and buy software in a cardboard box off the shelf, even though all that was inside of it was a floppy disk. We still call it off-the-shelf or OTS software. Sometimes it's called COTS, commercial off-the-shelf software. And it does open up a large can of worms. Before we talk in detail about off-the-shelf software and how it's regulated for pre-market submissions with FDA, let's talk again just about how things get developed for FDA. This diagram, I left the figure 1 header on it because I don't think many people know this. I went back to the original source of this diagram, which is now proliferated all across the internet. Everybody uses this. I mean, we use this at Into Being. We'll show it to people. Where does it come from? It does come from an FDA document on design controls. Most people don't include the figure number. Application of design controls to waterfall design process. FDA borrowed it from Health Canada. I just think you need to know that because I think it's entertaining. But this is, in a nutshell, the design control process. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about software, doesn't matter whether we're talking about hardware. You start with the needs of the user and the patient. These need to be reduced into design inputs. You're usually considering technical requirements, standards, risk analysis, and more in that process. From there, you can actually get into the design process, designing the device that you want to put on the market. The design output is the actual outputs, the schematics, the drawings, the diagrams, the bills of materials, the assembly diagrams that are used to put the device together. And from that, a finished medical device can be made. But let me use the word loose ends for just a minute here. There could be a million loose ends developed as a part of that process. And if you've ever been part of development, you know it's easy to get loose ends, things that don't line up. This waterfall and the 2 loop backs that occur in it, verification and validation, as well as the design reviews that are scattered throughout the process, are intended to remove loose ends. This is just as true about hardware as it is about software. If we understand this very, very basic principle, that the design and development process through the design control process, especially as specified in 21 CFR 820.30, is intended to show that there aren't any loose ends, or certainly not any loose ends that are worth considering any further. That and the final approval of the device, not by the FDA, but by the company putting it on the market, that final report that says this is ready to go, is really an analysis of whether there are loose ends that still need cleaning up. We had all our inputs. We made all our outputs. We were able to test them. We were able to demonstrate that everything that mattered was accomplished within that loop. Okay, so now you understand about loose ends. Well, let's go back to that latest FDA guidance on off-the-shelf software. If we just look at nothing more than the index, we'll see that there are documentation elements that FDA requires. There's nothing really surprising about these. There's description of off-the-shelf software. There's a risk assessment. Guess where that goes? That goes throughout the life cycle, but it starts in the design inputs. There's software testing as a part of verification and validation. They tell us right where that goes in the process. Now, this is something that maybe we're not as familiar with, the assurance of development methodologies and continued maintenance of the off-the-shelf software. This is one of those places where loose ends are going to crop up, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. This is really a search for loose ends that are unique to off-the-shelf software. Loose ends may be controllable. They may be boundable. And if they're not, it's going to create problems, just as though we never finished our design and development process. So even if you can take a piece of off-the-shelf software and stick it into your device, if you can't prove that the loose ends are controlled for, you may not want to use that within your device. We'll talk also about master files for devices, off-the-shelf software changes requiring a 510K. Today we're going to skip over investigational device exemption and changes, PMAs, and most of the product labeling stuff. But I want to get you a flavor for this. If you're interested in off-the-shelf software for investigational device exemptions for clinical trials, this would be a great document to come to. If you're interested in doing a PMA and using off-the-shelf software in it, this would be a great document to come to. The link is in the YouTube description, as it always is. FDA notes that the use of general purpose computer hardware and software, as it becomes more prevalent, OTS is just really attractive to use. But if it's intended for general purpose computing, you may not want to use it in a medical device. How would you know? Here's the key. If you use it, you're giving up software lifecycle control. That waterfall chart that we just showed, you don't actually own that with respect to the off-the-shelf software. Nor can you trust that a commercial off-the-shelf software vendor intended it for use in a medical device and is doing the things that are part of that waterfall. So now you're running sort of blind. All you can do is look for loose ends and bound them and risk manage them. That's really what this document is all about. And there are specifics in here that we'll go through. Again, it is a guidance, not legally enforceable like all FDA guidances, but FDA does hew pretty closely to their guidances when they can. So, OTS is something where the manufacturer cannot claim complete software lifecycle control. And this guidance applies to 510Ks, de novos, pre-market approvals, investigational device exemptions, or humanitarian device exemptions. Like FDA's new guidance on the content of pre-market submissions for medical device software, which we've covered in a previous episode, this documentation level now comes down to the idea of basic or enhanced. They're sort of moving away from the three-level process towards just basic or enhanced documentation. And there's not a lot of difference between the two for off-the-shelf software. You got to do everything for all of them with the exception of this assurance of development methodologies and continued maintenance of OTS software. So if you can say you're only requiring a basic documentation level, congratulations, you will be able to omit that last part. If you don't fit under the basic documentation level, you're probably going to have to do that. But let's talk about what's involved in some of these. So a description of the off-the-shelf software. FDA wants to know, in your pre-market submission, the title and manufacturer of the OTS software. That makes sense. How about the version level, the release date, the patch number, the upgrade designation, as appropriate? What software documentation will be provided to the end user? And why is it appropriate for this medical device? We've had applications before where the software exists and it's used for the purpose that we're interested in, even if it's not originally a medical purpose. So why wouldn't you reuse it? FDA is opening that door. They're making that possible. But what are the expected design limitations of the OTS software if it wasn't designed for this medical purpose? Are you getting yourself painted into a corner? In your design history file, where you're doing your design documentation, you do need to document what version, among other things, you're using, and you need to keep that updated. What about the computer system specifications for off-the-shelf software? Can it just run on anything? No, remember this is putting boundaries around loose ends. The more boundaries we can put around loose ends, the more likely FDA is going to be okay with the choice of us using off-the-shelf software. The hardware specifications, the software specifications, you want to document those. Don't just assume that, yeah, get this software, install it on something, and run it. Document all of those elements. How are you going to control the end user enough to make sure that they get the right results out of the software? Because you're not designing it. You're not even writing the training materials for it. You're just letting them use it like it is. Make sure they know what has to be installed or configured. What steps are permitted or have to be taken during the installation. How often will the configuration need to be changed? Education, training. And if there's parts of the software you don't want them using, how are you stopping them from using it? What if the OTS software gives them control that they shouldn't have? Can you really mitigate that? And if you can, make sure that you do and that you describe how it is mitigated. Functions. Function has become a big focus for basic versus enhanced documentation. What are the functions of it? What's it intended to do? Even if it didn't have an intended use like a medical device, you need to talk about it in those terms. How does it talk to other software outside of the medical device? You need to talk about verification and validation. It'd be nice to have a list of results of the testing, in fact, required. Is there a current list of off-the-shelf software problems or bugs to access and access to updates? Now, updates are a two-edged sword because if there are problems and the manufacturer of the software is updating them and you can take semi-control of that and you can roll that out to your users, well, that's a great assurance. But the flip side of that is, what if the software vendor makes changes and rolls them out and the software changes underneath the hood of your medical device? That's not so good. The potential for that is a loose end that you would want to control for. Where will you store the software? How will you ensure this is it? You're going to have to read through the document if you're doing OTS software, or happy to talk to you. But here's the thing. Where are the loose ends? Where could somebody go wrong? Don't take for granted that you just grab your laptop and install it and everything's going to be okay. Those loose ends have to be discovered, described, and mitigated. There's more in here about software testing. And then this assurance of development methodologies and continued maintenance of the software. This is the place where I think you'll want to pause if you do need enhanced documentation for your OTS and really, really understand Section D. We won't cover it in great depth right now, but this is a place where you need to convince yourself and convince FDA that the development and qualification documentation, you can assure it. There's some way to assure it. And it's hard because you don't own the company necessarily that's making the off-the-shelf software. Mechanisms for assuring the continued performance, maintenance, and support of the OTS software. I think there's two ways to go on this. Back in the days when a lot of programs were just one executable file that was never going to change, and once it was there, it was sort of there for good, and you get a version number and you're good to go. I mean, that's nice to be able to say, but so many times today, software is updated. You know, your phones, many of the apps are updated every 2 weeks. Well, if you're going to go with a software vendor off the shelf that does make changes, that might be good. They might be fixing bugs. But how do those software changes impact you? At some level, you're going to need some understanding or agreement with that company so that you can tell FDA, this is how it's going to change. This is not unlike the purchasing controls required as a part of 21 CFR 820. Where FDA suggests, it's not technically a requirement, that part of your purchasing agreements for hardware with your vendors actually cover the scenario where the product changes. And where possible, you should make it a part of your contract that the hardware vendor will let you know in advance when a product is changing so you can see what the impact is on your device. There's an echo of this in the software development methodologies and continued maintenance of off-the-shelf software. Now, there are some interesting opportunities. Master files for devices. I think this may be an unexplored place. I'm going to be talking in an upcoming week with a sterilization vendor with novel sterilization methods. You don't sterilize software, but one thing in common between sterilization methods, materials, and software is you can have master files. You can have a master file on record with the FDA. This is when a vendor says, we want to make it possible for people to use our material, our sterilization method, our software functions. So we're going to do a lot of that legwork for you. We're going to give it to FDA. We're not giving you the product. We're giving you the master file so that FDA, you can trust that a lot of that verification and validation and documentation is already done within that master file. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm using Gene's software. Hey, I'm using Gene's material. Hey, I'm using Gene's sterilization method. Go reference that master file. It's already on record with the FDA. Makes life that much easier. I think this is an unexplored area for software that really could come of age. Changes to off-the-shelf software requiring a new 510K. It's a very short paragraph. This is really no different than how we do it with other changes to medical devices. Deciding when to submit a 510K for a change to an existing device. That's the flowchart that we all know and love. We won't talk today about investigational device exemptions and changes there or pre-market approval. But labeling, one of the big things that's talked about there is simply that the user manual for your product specify the versions of the off-the-shelf software that can be used with the medical device. But note this, you wouldn't really need that for embedded software where the user does not select the software and cannot change the software. So if you're using OTS software embedded within your product, it's probably going to save you a lot of headaches versus saying, go to this website, download this software, install it, and then hope for the best. This is going to give you a lot more control if you can take some of the control away from the user and require less labeling on your part. So it's a brave new world with off-the-shelf software, maintenance and obsolescence considerations, safety, design, software testing as a part of V&V, installation, obsolescence, product configuration, considerations of operating systems, drivers, utilities. It's not that you wouldn't have to consider these things if you're developing your own software. It's just that FDA knows enough to say local area networks, LANs and other networks, to say if you're using off-the-shelf software, you better close up all these loopholes, close up all of these dangling threads so that you can really give us a risk analysis on this. There's examples in this document. You can read them if you're interested, but it's a really interesting document, and it's really cool to see FDA dealing with the question of software. So off-the-shelf software, the door is open. Is it a shoo-in? Should you always use off-the-shelf software and then go and submit it to FDA as a part of your device clearance? Not necessarily. It really is a question of, can you close off the loose ends, the dangling threads that are out there? That's really no different than the basic device development process that we follow at Intube, being the design control process or any other good device development firm, whether it's a startup or a third-party vendor. But that also applies to off-the-shelf software, but you don't control the design. So you have to bound it. You got to put that fence up around it and show that nothing is going to slip out of any major consequence. If you liked what you heard today, please like and subscribe to the video and to the channel. As always, free learning from MedTech Crossroads is going to save you headaches in your medical device development journey. Thank you for being with us. Next up, upcoming events in the local and national ecosystem. This summer, there's some things coming up. It always explodes about September. We haven't seen the explosion yet. So I think most of these you've seen in previous weeks. If you got to get out early, feel free for our live listeners. But MishBio coming up on August 22nd, having the BioConnections networking in Royal Oak, Michigan. Oh, we're having an issue there. We're going to get that off the screen. I wanted to show everybody our viral video again, Steve. You know, can't I gloat a little bit over that? MishBio having the BioConnections networking August 22nd in Royal Oak, Michigan. Free for MishBio members, $10 for all others. The Midwest Showcase is coming up next week, I believe, in Cleveland, Ohio. A lot of familiar faces there. Dwayne and others from Project MedTech putting on what looks to be a great event coming together. We'll see you in Ohio. The Women in MedTech Forum at Mass Medic happening in Boston, but it's actually a pretty easy flight, so you can get to these events even if you're part of the Michigan ecosystem. Celebrate Invention coming up September 14th at the Michigan Union. A wonderful event every single year, a great place to reconnect with old friends. Resi Boston, September 18th through 20th, if you're looking to fundraise or to find small life science companies and medtech companies, this is a place to go. And also in September 18th, the Michigan Life Sciences Showcase, Drug Discovery Symposium, Medical Device Summit, Digital Health Forum, Cannabis Science Symposium, and Patient Advocacy Forum with dedicated tracks for each event, as well as an exhibit floor, featuring suppliers and vendors serving the life science, research, and technology communities. MedTech Conference, October, Anaheim, California. Another Project MedTech event in Houston, Texas, October 25th and 26th. And the AI Summit and Combination Product Summits coming back to Columbus this fall. Finally, the Eye in the Chip 2023, October 8th through 10th, Dr. Hesberg's event at the Southfield Westin Hotel here in Michigan. If you have any questions about what we do on the show, comments, things you'd like us to cover, contact at medtechcrossroads.com. We would love to hear from you. There's the email address. And as always, on the live show, we always want to leave just a minute in case there's anybody with a question or a comment or an upcoming event that you would like to bring up. We are always, always happy to hear from you. So we will leave just a moment here at the end in case anyone has a question or a comment. Next week, it's going to be a really fun show. We're going to be talking about sterilization methods. FDA has blessed some new consensus standards for new sterilization methods. I think COVID shook everybody up, and the reduction in ethylene oxide sterilization, some challenges with radiation sterilization have opened the doors wide where even FDA is saying, hey, we need new ways to sterilize medical products. We're going to be talking with Tony Eisenhut, who is the CEO of a company called Novo Sterilis, next week. And he's going to be telling us about sterilization in general. He's going to be telling us about how novel sterilization methods are approved by FDA, cleared, accepted. Remember, master files comes into that as well. We're also going to be talking about what Novo Sterilis is doing with their supercritical carbon dioxide sterilization process and where that one is useful. So we'll look forward to seeing you next week here on MedTech Crossroads. Have a great time. Enjoy the rest of your summer.